I've seen lots of people saying that they don't like the sound of intersample peak limiters, which doesn't make a huge amount of sense to me, but I do have a theory about why they feel that way, and I think it's because of the way that they're testing them. And the reason I think that is that it happened to me as well. So I thought it might be interesting to show you what I mean and see what you think. And if you're not 100% sure what an intersample peak, an ISP, is, or why we might need to be concerned about them, or if you know all about true peaks, intersample peaks, but you don't think they're audible, then I made another video that goes into this and shows you that there definitely are cases where audio with intersample peaks can cause problems, especially further downstream. So it might be worth checking that one out first before you dig into this one, and I'll leave a link to that in the description below. And if you've ever thought or been told that super loud songs still sound louder than other material even after they've been reduced in loudness by online loudness normalization, make sure you watch right to the end of this video, because I'm going to show you that that's not necessarily true, and there may be an even better way to achieve a similar result. So, as the example for this video, I'm going to use the song Serenade by Ken Bauer. This song is actually from 2018, and Ken has offered me something more current that he feels better reflects where he's at now as an artist. So please do head over and listen to his more current work. But this makes a particularly good example because I know exactly what settings he used for the mastering and I can tweak them. And I wanted to use this just because it's a real world example. It's much louder than I usually master, but it's really going to help me demonstrate what I want to talk about. So I will start by playing you a section of the track as Ken originally mastered it. So it's big, it hits hard, and it's heavily limited. The loudness of the whole song comes out at -7 LUFS, and in the louder sections, it's right up at -5.6. And in my experience, people usually test ISP limiters in one of two ways, and both of them I think can be misleading, and I'm going to show you that. So the first way is to simply add an ISP limiter after whatever sample limiter they were used to using. So you can see that the sample peaks of this track are limited to -1, but the true peaks are up at 1.7 for this song. So let's imagine that we're adding in the Pro L2, and I will just show you that without true peak limiting, no extra limiting will be done. Both versions are limited to -1 dB FS. But now let me show you what happens if I enable ISP limiting. So I'm sure you can hear that. There is as much as 3.2 dB of extra limiting being added to that because the intersample limiter is able to predict what the analog reconstructed output of that waveform is likely to be and control it more cleanly. And you will probably hear a difference as a result of that, and you may or may not like it. The problem is that's not really a fair comparison because we've got 2 to 3 dB more limiting on one version than the other. If you've already set up a song so that you were happy with the way that it sounded without that limiting, you're unlikely to enjoy the sound of it with more. So what is a fairer way of making this comparison? Well, the goal is to remove intersample peaks, and we already know that without the true peak limiter, that example was peaking at plus 1.5 dB. So let's try another test. And this is the other common way that people often test true peak limiters, is to simply fire up the new version of the limiter they have and compare what happens when they enable and disable true peak limiting. So rather than having an extra true peak limiter at the end of the chain, they simply let one single limiter do all of the work, either with or without true peak enabled. So this example here is going to be the version without true peak limiting, and then we have exactly the same settings on the channel below, but with true peak limiting enabled. So let's see how these two compare. And again, you might feel that the true peak limited version perhaps sounds less exciting, but of course the sample peak version is allowing true peaks of almost 2 dB above 0. And if you're testing a true peak limiter, presumably you want to reduce those. So let's go into the limiter settings on the sample peak version, and we'll just reduce the output ceiling by 2 dB. So now we have similar, hopefully, true peak levels on both versions. Let's check that. Here is the sample peak limited version. And in fact, we're still a little bit higher than the true peak limited version. So let's take that back just a little bit further. But now, of course, the sample limited version sounds noticeably quieter than the true peak limited version. So that's not a fair comparison either. So let's increase the loudness of the sample limited version to try and compensate for that drop in gain, because the goal of all of this is to master loud. So we took down the level by 2.5 dB, so let's add 2.5 dB to there. And of course, this song is hitting the limiter hard, much harder than I would normally recommend. But as I say, it's a real-world example. This is what Ken chose for this song at the time. And actually, as part of my membership group, I did a comparison between a more dynamic version of my own and his, and the sound of the limiter is remarkably successful considering how hard it's being pushed. So anyway, let's take a listen to this. And let's compare that with the true peak limited version. That's closer, but the true peak limited version is still about a dB louder than the sample limited version. So let's increase that gain there to 16 dB. We're still about a dB shy. Let's increase that to 18 dB. That's 6 dB more input gain to the sample limited version to try and get the loudness to compare. That's still not working. Let's just take a listen and compare the sound. Here is the true peak limited version. So you can see we have a catch-22. No matter how hard we push the input gain to the sample limited version, we're reaching the point where the limiter is just constantly pulling the gain back. We can't achieve any more apparent or actual loudness as an output. So we're not going to be able to get a fair comparison this way either. This isn't a fair test. We're now being unfair to the sample limiter, whereas previously we were, if you like, being unfair to the true peak limiter. So let's try and find a more balanced comparison to make. Because remember, the goal is to find a fair comparison between the sound of intersample, true peak aware limiting and regular sample limiting. So let's return this to the gain that Ken chose, and that means the true peak version will now be a few dB louder, so we can take back the input gain to that by a few dB. So now we've got the same LUFS level for both the true peak, the ISP limited version, and the sample limited version. Neither of them are allowing any true peaks through, so let's try that comparison. And I'd be interested to know what you think of that difference. To me, the true peak version now sounds better. I'm actually hearing more snap and impact on the transients there. And that makes sense because we were able to pull back the input gain. We're pushing it 3 dB less hard, and I hear less of a difference in sound between those two. In fact, if anything, true peak limiting sounds slightly better to me. So, in my opinion, when you find a fair test which is matched LUFS for the comparison between true peak and sample limiting, true peak sounds just as good, if not slightly better. Now, of course, in order to do that, we did reduce the overall gain a dB or two from where Ken originally wanted it. But for me, the next natural question is, now that we've established that ISP limiting, true peak limiting in and of itself doesn't sound worse than sample limiting, the question is how much harder could we push this and still get a result that we were happy with? We've backed off the input gain by 3 dB to get this result. My guess is we could push that another dB, maybe another dB and a half or 2 dB, and especially if we're then prepared to tweak the limiter settings, I think you can get a version that is loud enough and sounds better and doesn't have any intersample peaks, which in my book is a win-win. And there's one more thing I want to show you in this video. In this lower clip here, I have adjusted the settings so that we have sample peak limiting only, with the output ceiling reduced to avoid intersample clipping and the input gain boosted by an extra 3 dB to keep the loudness level up. And then here I have a true peak limited version with only 10.5 dB of input gain, but a higher output ceiling. And you'll see this time I've set it to minus 0.6 instead of minus 1. That's because I wanted to ensure that the integrated LUFS of the entire song was identical. So you can see in this case we have minus 8.6 for the true peak limited version, and here is the sample peak limited version. You can see the sample peak levels are much lower. You can see how much more limiting has been used here to achieve this loudness, but this also has an integrated loudness of minus 8.6 LUFS. And the reason I've done this is that this is exactly how streaming loudness services like Spotify, Tidal, and YouTube would match the loudness of these two alternative masters of the same song. So now let's see how that sounds at the loudest section. Here is the true peak limited version. So you can see minus 5.9 LUFS there. Here is the sample peak limited version. You can see that's measuring lower, about half a dB lower. Let's see, I'll flick between them so you can see whether that comes across in the sound as well. So, not sure how you feel about it. To me, that sounds like the true peak version is actually hitting harder in that section, and there's a lot more distortion in the sample peak limited version. But now see what happens when we listen to the beginning of the song. think it's pretty clear to hear there that the True Peak Limited version actually sounds quieter in this section of the song. So what's happening? They have the same overall or integrated loudness, but during the quieter section, the sample peak limited version sounds louder, and during the loudest section, the True Peak Limited version sounds louder. The difference is that in this sample limited version, we've pushed the input gain by 15 dB. Now we've taken the output down by 3.5, so that comes out as 11.5 overall, but we're only lifting the True Peak version's gain by 10.5. So there's a whole extra dB of input gain on the sample limited version that we don't have on the True Peak limited version. And that, I think, is why people will often tell you that a song that is pushed harder will sound louder even after it's been loudness normalized. Because remember, both of these files are at the same overall integrated loudness. But if you put these two versions on, the introduction to the True Peak version is not going to sound as loud as the more heavily sample limited version. So that, surely, is an argument for using the sample limited version, even if we have to use extra limiting, even if the louder sections end up being more distorted. My answer to that is very simply no. If that's a concern for you, I have a much better and much cleaner method of solving that problem, which is automation. We can simply lift any section of the song that we want to be louder in the True Peak limited version. So we're achieving the same overall level increase using the True Peak Limited version, but in a cleaner way. So I disagree that pushing the overall level higher gets a better result. We can have the same louder impression, even with the True Peak Limited version, using a little bit of subtle automation, and we don't cause the damage that we heard to this louder section here in the much more heavily sample limited version. We can have our loudness cake and eat it, or some other similar analogy. Now, personally, I'm lucky that I don't often have to be concerned about loudness for its own sake in the way that I'm demonstrating in this video. I just do whatever sounds best for the music. So the strategy I use is to enable True Peak limiting from the outset, have an output ceiling of -1 dB, and not push the loudness too hard into that limiter. I found that is highly successful for getting great sounding masters that my clients love and that work well on all of the streaming platforms. I'm not saying you need to use an intersample limiter if you don't want to, but I do hope that this has perhaps made you think again about the idea that the way that you're making your comparison between True Peak and sample limiting could be misleading, and maybe encourage you to do some tests of your own and try and figure out whether an intersample limiter might actually be a good option for you and the music you're working on. So there you go. I hope that was useful or interesting. If you've been experimenting with intersample peak aware limiters, let me know in the comments what you think. Do you like the way that they sound? And was this the way that you did your tests? If so, has this video made you think about trying that again and possibly revising your opinion? And if you like this video, I think you will also love a free PDF I've put together called the Home Mastering Guide. And it sets out what I think are the 6 essential steps to releasing your music with complete confidence. It's completely free and you can get it at homemasteringguide.com. My name is Ian Shepherd. Thanks for listening.